Well, today is the fourth Sunday of Advent, and this thought could raise one of two reactions. You could be excited because next week is Christmas, yay! Or it could also cause you panic because, well, next week is Christmas and you still have a lot to do, so, Our reading from Matthew this morning goes something like this. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah takes place in this way. Or, now the Genesis, the beginning of Jesus the Messiah, takes place in this way. Then we're led into the part of the narrative where Joseph has found out Mary is with child and they aren't married yet. And Joseph must figure out what to do about Mary. Now, I have to be honest, when I read through this gospel reading earlier this week, I fell into a trap because you can fall into Team Joseph or Team Mary. And I started to make this reading about Joseph's righteousness, and his faith in God's message to him while he was sleeping, how he humbly accepted the instruction given to him, and how he loved Mary faithfully. Or we might choose to focus on Mary, the young woman who said yes to God and is now with child, who, if Joseph chose to quietly send away, would have been a single mom who would have been shamed and ostracized because of her supposed promiscuity. However, as I was reading this later on in the week, my son Mikey and I were sitting in the living room, and he was sitting on the other side of the couch playing his Switch game. And I finished reading this out loud to myself, and Mikey slowly lowered his Switch, and he asked me a great question. You know, kids have an uncanny ability to multitask. I didn't even know he was listening, but he lowered his Switch and he asked, "Daddy, did Jesus have two fathers?" I'll share with you the answer I gave Mikey. And I hope you're ready for this. I mean, I did go to seminary, and I am a priest. So here it is. Yes, Jesus had two fathers. Nailed it. Nailed it. Now, all joking aside, I did give that answer to my 7-year-old, but you all aren't 7 years old, so I'll give a little bit more context. Today's gospel from Matthew gives us a different perspective of the birth narrative. Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus going all the way back to Abraham and Isaac. And while I certainly understand why the lectionary omits this bit of the story, however, for Matthew, it is an important part of tying Jesus back to the beginning. Even in our reading for today, verse 18 begins with, "Now the birth of Jesus." This is the Genesis, the beginning, the origin story. Now, what I want us to do is I want us to look back at the very beginning of Matthew, the beginning of the gospel, and I want to read the genealogy to you. This is the time where if I mess up a name, you can laugh at your priest. It's great, but just hang in here because we're going to see some famous names dropped. Ready? So let's all just take a collective big breath. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, and Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Still with me? We're not done. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation of Babylon. Almost there. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah and his father of Salthanel, and Salthiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zodak, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So let's look at some of the names, just a couple of the names that were dropped. We had Abraham, the father of Israel, David, the greatest king, Solomon, the great mind and builder of the first temple, and a whole host of kings and characters. It's a who's who of the Old Testament, and it ties Jesus back to the leaders of Israel, going back to the beginning. However, let me address the elephant in the room. This genealogy ties Joseph to all these people. But we know that Joseph is not Jesus' biological father, and you'd be correct in saying that Joseph is not Jesus' biological father. Even at the end of the genealogy in verse 17, we read, Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. And here is where we begin our reading of the birth narrative of Jesus. Joseph was visited by an angel of the Lord in a dream, and the angel tells Joseph, you are to give him the name Jesus. Mary will bear a son, and you, Joseph, you are to name him Jesus. Are you still with me? Yes. When Joseph names the child, he adopts Jesus as his son. And at that point, Joseph's family becomes Jesus' family. And this is what makes Jesus a descendant of David. And this is how we get a Messiah that is not subject to original sin, because he, Jesus, is not from a human male, but from God and born of a virgin, Mary. And that's what I meant to tell Mikey, in that, yes, he has two fathers. So we begin to see that this birth narrative does not begin in verse 18 of chapter 1. Rather, for Matthew, it begins in Genesis. And it transports us back all the way to the beginning. And Matthew starts his gospel with the lineage of Joseph, who will adopt Jesus as a son when he names Jesus at the presentation at the temple. And you guys thought it was a simple story of the birth of a special child. When I read Matthew, I must keep in mind that the narrative is pretty straightforward. It tracks on the same timeline as Mark and Luke. However, Matthew transports us all over the Old and New Testaments. Even with these simple few verses, we are transported to Genesis, to Isaiah, to Hebrews, to the Psalms. And then my favorite part, at the end of our reading for today, the text reads, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Which, this takes us right to the very end of Matthew, the Great Commissioning, when he ends with, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. It's easy to read these 8 short verses in Matthew and quickly pick a side of the narrative to be on. Are you Team Joseph? Are you Team Mary? However, it's so much more than that. It tells us about God's plans he has for Joseph and Mary. It tells us how prophecy is going to be fulfilled. It tells us about how Jesus has two fathers. And it shows us the miraculous work of God in our world. These short 8 verses. Now, tonight, when we have our live nativity, and we see the baby Jesus wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in the manger, what we begin to see is not a baby at all. We see the Alpha, the Omega, the Genesis, and the end. We see a child born a king. We see God's inbreaking into the world in the form of a little baby. We see the love God has for each and every one of us. A babe in a manger, a child born king, Emmanuel, God with us. Now that is something to celebrate as we look forward to his return. Amen.